And we are happy to welcome back to the studio Irshad Manji. She is the author most recently of Allah, Liberty and Love, The Courage to Reconcile Faith and Freedom. She is the director of the Moral Courage Project at NYU. And I guess, as I always like to say when you make your all too infrequent visits back here, welcome back to your old studio.
Absolutely. This is my old stomping ground. I feel very much at home, Steve.
You know how many years ago it was that you were doing Friendly Fire with Michael Corrin?
Do you really need to tell the audience that?
I think I do.
Okay.
I think I do.
20?
14, 15, 16, something like that?
Around 20, my friend.
I remember being,
yes, I remember being in my very early 20s when Michael and I were going, hand-to-hand combat. And by the way, I had occasion to recently hug him again, and we had a wonderful time. So things change.
I'm
People
glad you're
change.
Pals.
We are.
Okay,
unlike
good.
you and me.
No, we're pals too. I want to start talking to you about Islamists and Islam. And most particularly because I guess the most important events that have transpired since you were last here are the so-called Arab Spring. And I want to know how you feel that's changed the perception of Islam within the Islamic world.
Well, I can tell you that even 5 years ago, when I found myself in Cairo, in the midst of what were then the biggest protests against government corruption and authoritarianism, I sensed, even at that time, a sense of aspiration rather than merely anger. And I can tell you a quick story. I hung out with a bunch of democracy activists afterwards and had wonderful conversations with many of them. And one of them, a woman, I'll never forget her, she came up to me and she said, "Irshad, I recall you from your many international interviews, and I've got to confide a problem to you." She said, "I've fallen in love with a Jewish man, and I don't believe that he needs to convert to Islam. The thing is, here I am putting my neck on the line to effect political change in my country, and yet the far scarier thing is to talk to my own parents about love."
What'd you tell her?
Well, I said to her, I got to think about this one. And in due course, actually, I took this dilemma to a progressive imam in America, asking him to reinterpret the very verses of the Quran that have traditionally been used to stop women in particular from marrying outside the faith. He came up, Steve, with a 2-page concise blessing of interfaith marriage from an Islamic perspective. And get this, when I put it up on my website in English, after only 6 months, it became such a popular download that I had to get it translated into 20 more languages.
What does that say to you?
That says to me that a new generation, much like what we've seen with the Arab Spring, is hungering to reconcile faith and freedom.
You've spoken about how Islam in Canada is defined by multiculturalism and Islam in the United States is defined by 9/11. The 10th anniversary of 9/11 just transpired. It was a big day for you. I know it was a very emotional day for all Americans. How likely is it that the Arab uprisings are going to come to define the Western notion of Islam in all of North America?
I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, Steve. And keep in mind that, the United States itself has needed 200 plus years to reach this point of dysfunction in its democracy, all right? After the American Revolution, 100 plus more years were needed to overcome slavery. After that, 100 plus more years to overcome the residue of slavery, namely segregation. And so we've got to accord at least that much time to many of the Arab countries in order to develop truly, democratic values. But I talked earlier about aspiration among a new generation of Muslims. And I tell you, even here in the United States and Canada, you see young people still very fearful of being told that they're dishonoring their families, nonetheless come to me and say, Irshad, it's time. I'm with you. I'm walking this journey with you. And I remember one Canadian kid by the name of Hamza. He said that he himself is thoroughly Canadian. He happens to have Pakistani parents. He said, "Don't leave Islam. We need people like you." But then he said something else, Steve. He said, "Could you lay out a positive vision of what Islam can be?" And I loved that question because it showed faith in my capacity to grow along with him. So you see, this really is a journey for many of us who have been lucky enough to be born or have come, as I did, as a political refugee in a free and open society. And it's going to take at least a generation, maybe more.
Is there still, in your view, I know you maybe don't know Canada as well anymore because you've been in the States for so long, but is there still an overwhelmingly negative view, in your view, of the Islamic religion in North America?
Not so much a negative view as a great deal of fear. And I'll give you, again, a very quick example of why that's happening. It doesn't have to do really with Islamophobia. It has to do with Muslims' own fear of coming clean about what's going on within our own communities. Remember when Major Nidal Malik Hassan in Fort Hood, Texas, opened fire on his fellow soldiers? Now, the words Allahu Akbar were shouted from his lips at the time that God is great, as he was, spraying his fellow soldiers with bullets. Many so-called moderate Muslim organizations in the United States, first thing they did in their press releases is they said, don't misunderstand, Islam has nothing to do with this. Now, you can't blame non-Muslims for wondering, well, if Islam has nothing to do with this, why the words Allahu Akbar, God is great? The problem, Steve, is that Muslims don't want to own up to the fact that some religious inspiration plays a role. And so they deny it. And when they deny it, they give non-Muslims a reason to be that much more suspicious. So what Muslims believe they're doing in the name of keeping the peace, actually they're creating even more defenses among those who wonder, well, what do you have to hide if you're not even going to address this question?
Do you think that confrontation is coming between the kind of mainstream Islamic community, which is like any other community, and this radical Islamism that is within the community?
I wish I could say that confrontation was coming, because it needs to happen.
But you're not sure yet.
I'm not convinced yet. I think it's going to be a much more kind of subtle process. But I will say this much. The confrontation needs to happen because, as Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out to moderate Christians in 1960s America, moderation in a time of moral crisis is a cop-out. You see, moderate Christians at the time, King pointed out, were hemming and hawing about speaking up against segregation that was going on in the name of Christianity. And he called them on it. He didn't want them to be moderates. He wanted them to be reformers, just like he was being. And I think if you apply the same analysis to what's going on within Islam today, the so-called moderates are not very moderate at all. They let extremist interpretations get a pass. And what I'm seeing in Allah, Liberty, and Love is that so-called moderates have to step up to the plate in the world of Islam and actually offer bold and competing reinterpretations of the very verses that are used to supposedly hijack Islam, as moderates love to tell us.
In a weird way, you're kind of channeling a bit of Barry Goldwater there.
Ooh.
As in, well, let me put it this way. Insofar as you're saying moderation in the defense, or moderation in opposition to all of this stuff which you find so objectionable.
Well, and many people find objectionable, not just myself.
But it's terrible, right? A little extremism in the face of this objectionable conduct is okay.
And yes, and by the way, MLK himself pointed that out as well. He actually called for what he described, not me, he described as creative extremism. Now, in the context of Islam today, of course, that would be a very tense thing to say, because the word extremism has taken on such higher stakes over the last number of years. But keep in mind, King was making the distinction between destructive extremism and that kind of extremism that you will be accused of when you add value to the struggle for genuine peace.
Okay, you mentioned your website off the top, and I want to come back to this notion of how online is changing things right now in the Muslim world. The empowerment of Muslims to share political ideas online. How has that changed how Muslims perceive the limits of cultural Islam?
Right. It's a really interesting question, because I must tell you, I don't think that I could be doing the work I'm doing as a reformist Muslim were it not for digital technologies. You know, the fact that after my earlier book came out, Muslims primarily from the Middle East and then many other places in the world, pelted me with emails asking, when are you going to get the book translated into Arabic so we can share these ideas with our friends? And these kids, Steve, were the ones who gave me the idea to get the book translated into Arabic and post it on my website for free of charge download. By now, more than 2 million downloads. Never mind all of the times it's photocopied and circulated thereafter. There is no question that social media in particular have given young Muslims a way of expressing themselves, in many cases anonymously, to be able to transcend the fears of speaking to their own parents or to their own elders. But keep in mind that technology also can be used for the opposite reasons. Violent jihadis, for example, are exceptionally adept at using the internet, as we know too well. And so I would suggest to you that technology is rather like religion. It's not the fact of having it that's the problem. It's what you choose to do with it.
Well, it is a neutral thing, right? It can be used for
On
good or
its
for
own,
bad.
absolutely,
It's
on its
neutral.
own, that's
Okay.
right.
And again, apropos of your first story, the fear young Muslims have of dishonoring their families.
Yeah.
To what extent has the empowerment of Muslim youth, perhaps as manifest in the Arab revolutions, alleviated this fear?
Oh, no, it hasn't alleviated the fear
hasn't,
as such. Though, one thing I have noticed is that in non-Arab parts of the world, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, work like mine is picking up more speed. In fact, the new book, Allah, Liberty, and Love, is likely going to be coming out in the local language in Malaysia even before it comes out in any of the European countries. Now, why does that matter? Because only 3 years ago, the Malaysian government, though it declares itself a secular government, put my work on its officially banned books list. Today, a book like mine can be published in the local language. And what I've heard from my very young publishers in Malaysia is that if the Arabs can rise up for their freedoms, what's stopping us from doing the same?
Your publisher is going to be so happy with you because you've mentioned the book title twice already.
No,
You're good at this, I
know,
can tell.
No, and it's not about that as such. It's just that the new book does represent for me a culmination of the engagement that I've been doing with both Muslims and non-Muslims right around the world for the past decade. And they have taught me a great deal about what we can see behind the headlines when we watch geopolitically what's going on.
I get you. I'm teasing you a bit, that's all.
Well,
let me read something here. This is from the Arab Counter-Revolution in the New York Review of Books. I'm going to read an excerpt here. The young street demonstrators challenge the status quo, ignite a revolutionary spirit, and point the way for a redistribution of power. But what they possess in enthusiasm, they lack in organization and political experience.
Yeah.
What gives them strength during the uprising, their amorphous character and impulsiveness, leads to their subsequent undoing. Right. Their domain is the more visible and publicized. The real action, much to their chagrin, takes place elsewhere. Now, I gather one of your main messages for young reformers is to speak truth to authority, which you've been doing for many years, but there's a limit on how much the young demonstrators, is there a limit to how much these young demonstrators can actually achieve to this point?
Yes, in the short run, yes. And I think that that's also part of democracy, is that I do believe some very bad anti-democratic choices are going to be made in places like Egypt over the next number of years.
Like what?
Well, for example, like the further empowerment of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, they're not the most radical of the radical, but they are very, very conservative, and they are extremely canny.
But they're moderate compared to a lot of the others.
Isn't that my point about
Yeah.
the trouble with moderate Muslims, by the way, right? Nonetheless, what I think will be happening, and I can say this with almost, absolute certitude, because this really is part of democracy, is that when you live under a dictatorship, you have no choices, and therefore it's easy to point fingers at the outside world and say, all of you out there are responsible for all of my community's problems. But under even a fledgling democracy, when you make choices, including bad ones, eventually you're going to have to step up to the plate, both as a citizen and as a society, and say, we own this. Now this is our problem. And so, despite the bumps in the road, I really do believe that the victim mentality and the conspiracy theories are going to see their demise over the next couple of decades in the Arab world.
Let me get your take on this, though. When Islamists win free and fair elections, as I think you'd agree they did in Algeria and Hamas in
In
Gaza, should they be allowed to take power?
Yes.
They should.
Yes. Of
Despite
course.
how objectionable you find their ideology.
It's not, sure, I can state that I find it objectionable, but it's not for me to stop autonomous individuals from making really bad choices.
We did do that, though.
Oh, what?
In Algeria.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, we
They
did
won
stop them.
and the West kicked them out.
And how did that turn out for us, Steve?
Not great, eh?
No, not great. Exactly. Okay. Which is, by the way, and I know that this will ruffle more than a few feathers among supporters of mine. This is also why I really do believe that Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority, needs to be given the opportunity now to create a state through the United Nations, if only so that the rest of the world can hold Mahmoud Abbas and his flunkies accountable for what they say they are able to do in terms of institution building. Really? Let's put our money where your mouth is. Let's make it happen. And then let's show the rest of the Arab world how difficult governance actually is.
Let's finish up on this, Irshad. How much of a role do you see political Islam playing in the post-revolution climate?
It's going to be big, Steve.
Big.
Yes, it will be. The fact of the matter is, and you alluded to this earlier, the secular Democrats who ignited the uprisings, particularly in Egypt and in Tunisia, cannot at the moment organize their way out of a paper bag. Various Western governments actually don't know yet how to support these young people without immediately having them be branded as, sellouts to the Zionist and U.S. demons. So this is going to take time, and I do believe that it will get worse for those of us living in this part of the world before it gets better. But maybe it has to be that way because, again, people cannot learn just how difficult and fragile democracy is until they have their own experiences with it. And the key here is the word own. We can't do it for Arabs. They've got to do it for themselves now. So let them stumble, let them fumble, as we continue to do in this part of the world, and maybe we'll develop a little bit of empathy on both sides.
But when you were in Egypt, did you see pictures of bin Laden in the streets? Were people holding up?
No,
So
I saw pictures of Mubarak, and I saw a lot of anger against him.
So did you find it encouraging that you didn't find pictures of bin Laden?
Oh, I mean, frankly, I didn't expect to see photos of bin Laden. Again, in Cairo in particular, we're talking about a relatively cosmopolitan, relatively, urban, and highly educated in many cases, young population. No, what gave me the hope was that, this woman who wants to marry this Jewish guy is saying this now and wants to know how she can make this clear to her parents instead of wallowing in denial about it. Small steps, not just, national politics, but family politics. And so you can see that it's a very complex and I think hopeful reality behind the headlines that we're going to be fed over the next many months.
Got to let me know how that one turns out.
I think you'll be letting me know how it turns out.
Okay.
But I'll keep you all posted.
I appreciate that very much. Irshad Manji, author of Allah, Liberty, and Love, The Courage to Reconcile Faith and Freedom. As always, thanks for coming back to TVO.
Thank you, Steve.